Greetings, everyone. Peter Maravellis here, welcoming you to a special edition of City Lights Live, the online extension of the City Lights events calendar. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. It is always an honor and a privilege to be able to do so. On today's program, we welcome Joanna Sokol discussing her fantastic new book titled A Real Emergency: Stories from the Ambulance. It's published by Strange Light Books. For 10 years, Joanna Sokol worked on a 9/11 ambulance covering a diverse series of beats from the beaches of Santa Cruz to the high desert of Reno, as well as the hills of San Francisco itself. During her time as an EMT, she began privately filling notebooks with her experiences. Her notes were often made first on scraps of paper, the backs of gloves, on EKG printouts, and it was from these records kept by her to process many of her intense experiences from which this remarkable book emerged. Stories from the Ambulance is a deep dive into the everyday reality of 911 first responders, offering insight, empathy, and a reminder of both the power and limitations in our ability to care for others. Previous to her time as an EMT, Joanna Sokol spent time as a ski patroller, a wilderness EMT, and medic for raves and music festivals. During her time at the San Francisco Fire Department, she received an award for clinical excellence and served as a member of the Street Crisis Response Team. Her writing has appeared in Reader's Digest, Epoca, Hazlitt, and she has received a Sydney Award for her work in 2019. Born and raised in Oakland, California, Ms. Sokol currently makes her home in Santa Cruz. She has a special connection to City Lights, as she has spent many an evening cross-legged on the floor of the bookstore, reading everything from Ginsberg to Henry Miller, William Burroughs, Anais Nin, amongst others. She expressed to us that these were formative literary experiences for her. In her own words, she inhaled a lot of beat writing. So joining her in conversation will be Cynthia Gorney. Ms. Gorney is a former staff writer and South America bureau chief for the Washington Post. She is also emerita professor at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism and longtime contributor to The New Yorker, National Geographic Magazine, The New York Times, Harper's, amongst many other media outlets. She is the author of Articles of Faith, a Frontline History of the Abortion Wars, published by Simon & Schuster. She grew up in North Beach here in San Francisco and was a regular at City Lights, much like Joanna. Something they have in common, besides many other things. An interesting factoid for all of you watching. I'd like to mention that Ms. Sokol and Ms. Gorney have a relation in common. They are mother and daughter, which adds a certain dimension to today's proceedings. So we have posted links in the event description with which you may purchase copies of Stories from the Ambulance. It is with great pleasure that we bring you Joanna Sokol in conversation with Cynthia Gorney. A very warm welcome to you both, and welcome to City Lights.
Thank you so much. This is really exciting.
Thank you, Peter. This is an amazing experience for us for all the reasons that you just articulated. And the place I want to start actually is with City Lights and North Beach. As Joanna knows very well, because I used to force her to walk those streets with me, I grew up in North Beach and spent much of my formative years sitting like Joanna, cross-legged on the floor at City Lights. And I want to ask you, Joe, what did you see? You know what I saw as a young person, as a teenager, as an adult, walking the streets of North Beach, even after I no longer lived there. You, as a medic, saw something pretty different. And I want you to talk about that a little bit. And I want you to read a little bit from the intro to your book.
Talk first or read first?
Talk a little bit and then read first. And then read. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to bring up a more recent family memory. We did a big holiday meal in North Beach a couple of years ago with like many different parts of the family. It was a big gathering and I was really stressed about it. I didn't want to go. I was really mad at my brother who had decided where the location was going to be. And I was like, oh, there's going to be traffic. There's going to be parking. Yeah, I don't want to go. I was being kind of a brat about it. And I didn't realize until we actually arrived there and started walking around that for me, North Beach was the site of a lot of pretty rough memories. I spent, when I was working on the ambulance, answering 911 calls, we went to North Beach from time to time. We would run calls there and it kind of fit in with the rest of the city. And I spent the last couple of years of my career on the street crisis unit, which was a special project started by Mayor Breed to deal with homelessness, mental health, and drug addiction issues out in the streets. And during that time, my beat was North Beach. It was the North Beach Chinatown waterfront unit. That was where we were assigned to. And so I spent about a year and a half all over the city, but largely in North Beach, responding to site calls, responding to people screaming and yelling and taking their clothes off and getting in fights and setting up camp in those little outdoor spaces that the restaurants had all built after COVID, and then getting in fights with the restaurant about whether that was public space or not. And it became a really different North Beach than the one that you grew up in and the one that we went to a lot when I was a kid. It was no longer like a fun sort of touristy side of the city with restaurants and strip clubs. It was the site of a lot of screaming, a lot of yelling, a lot of really, really angry people. And so I realized when we went on this family dinner, we were all gathering for, I don't know, Christmas or Thanksgiving or something. And the rest of the family was having a really nice time. And it was the first time in months, if not years, that I'd been in North Beach as a visitor and not as a paramedic.
So I think sometimes about you as a medic, you in uniform, seeing the same things I, and of course the rest of the world sees, but with a sort of X-ray eyes. You have a different kind of vision. And now I want you to read that excerpt from the introduction, because that was when I was just starting the manuscript, one of the times that I read it. I remember thinking, oh wow, different eyeballs. So show us what you mean.
So I think this was the one at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
We had marked off about 2 paragraphs.
Yeah, page 19. Right?
As a street medic, I'm never going to see most patients' lab values, but I'll see the inside of their bedroom and their neighbors' bedrooms. I'll see the photos stacked in the dark corner of a closet before I'll ever see a chest x-ray. I climb my bags up 3 flights of stairs, past potted plants, framed certificates, and family photos. I know which houses have illegal back units, which have meth labs, which have a beautiful rooftop deck. I look in the fridge for insulin. A patient directs me into her closet to pick out a jacket to wear to the emergency room. She doesn't like the yellow one. Grab the blue behind it. A Vietnam infantry hat falls as I reach for the hanger. She tells me to put it back. It was her husband's once. The edges of the hat are worn thin. I see moldy kitchens, rotted attics. I leave food out for pets, switch off lights, turn down the stove under a pot of oxtails. Once I read half a poem left in a dead woman's typewriter. We call it the scene. What was the scene like? Is the scene safe? Are we at a house, a clinic, an alleyway behind a row of dumpsters?
There's another part that talks about your changing relationship also with San Francisco, where you never lived, but where you spent a lot more time in many ways than I ever did. Or in a very different kind of time on page 143. And your brother had moved to San Francisco and lived there like one kind of San Franciscan, first by himself and then with his wife and his growing family. So read that part too, starting with I went through phases in San Francisco.
Okay. And then I believe we're going all the way down to a little bit farther.
Yeah.
I went through phases with San Francisco. When the pain and addiction I saw in homeless encampments was too much for me, I blamed it all on the city, as though the skyscrapers themselves represented the hulking supervillains who had caused this tragedy. I said it was all the fault of rich people and politicians and the tech industry. I read gold rush history, telling myself that this city was founded in drunken greed and only got worse from there. Some days I made it the patient's fault for coming to this godforsaken town in the first place. But other times, my heart would soften. I'd see SF as a gathering of humans who came out west in search of a better life, whatever that meant for them. I'd smile at the languages spoken on the bus, or the huge families stepping over each other in tiny apartments. I realized San Francisco was made of 1,000 human stories, no better or worse than anywhere else. Eventually, I even learned to love the city. It was gross and crowded and overpriced, but the pulse of it pulled me in. I carried an unconscious man out of a clearly illegal upstairs gambling den in Chinatown that looked like a racist movie set. I grew to know every hotel in the Tenderloin, 100-year-old wallpaper hiding roaches and ghosts. I learned how to say chest pain in Russian and Cantonese. I knew which station bathrooms might have an EMT sleeping on an air mattress on the floor, which of my partners were due for knee surgery or putting their kids through school. I worked with a girl who grew up in the Sunnydale projects on the Samoan block. She took me to the Samoan Community Center and introduced me around, then showed me where to get all the best food in the neighborhood. I stared out at fog and hills and candy-colored houses and bricks and liquor stores and muni buses and more fog. I ate delicious pho in the rain, broth sloshing over the sides of the styrofoam. I teared up laughing at the punch-drunk gallows humor that we shouted out rolled down windows to each other at 3 a.m. I paid 3 times as much as I ever thought I would for the best croissant in America, and then cursed when I realized it was worth every penny.
Whoa.
So,
So what I want you to do, for people who don't know, which is certainly me before you started this work, and most of the people I know, what actually happens when my neighbor picks up the phone and calls 911? Now, I ask this in this way particularly because I now live in Oakland. And
mhm.
so what I'd like you to do is start with San Francisco. And I'm talking just technically, where does that call go? A lot of people are confused about the fact that they see fire departments, they see fire department trucks,
Yeah.
they see private trucks, they see AMR trucks. So describe, first of all, the process in San Francisco.
Yeah. So there's a dispatch center. And that's generally done on a county level. So anywhere you call 911, you pick up the phone, you dial the magic number, it's going to go to a county dispatching center. And what that means is somewhere in your county, there's a big, usually really boring looking building with a bunch of people sitting in chairs just picking up the phone. That's their job. And when they pick up the phone, they're going to say fire, police, or medical. And then depending which one you say, they're going to send your call out to the fire department, to the police, or to the ambulance. And then it's going to get transferred to somebody else. And that person is going to start sending out equipment before they get your information. They're going to start sending out what you need, which is, I actually mentioned because a lot of people kind of panic when we start to say, okay, what's your name? Where are you? And they're like, no, just send someone. It's like, we already did. They're on the way. And then that dispatching center has a bunch of computer screens all over the place, and they have a big map on the wall, like a live map of where all of the resources in the county are, where all the cops are, where all the ambulances are posted, where all the fire engines are posted, and they're going to see who's closest, and they're going to send someone out. And where it gets a little bit confusing is that if you need police help, they're going to send police. If your building's on fire, they're going to send fire. But if you have a medical issue, they're usually going to send fire and an ambulance. And the reasons for that are a little bit complicated and historical and political. And I don't know if you want to get into them or not.
Not yet, not yet. I want to
Yeah.
talk about that in a minute, but right now I'm just trying to understand the way the system is theoretically supposed to work, right?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, you call a person in a room full of computers, they send you a resource. That's the quick answer.
And in San Francisco, they would send you, the first ambulance they would send you would be one run by you and some of your colleagues, or would it be a private service?
Oh, you wish it was that simple of an answer.
Okay, hold that thought then. Hold that thought as we get to the
Yeah.
complications, the systemic complications. Now, one of the first things that we encounter in this narrative is what I'm calling the you can't say no, and also you can't say yes problem for a paramedic.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean by this, right? But I think a lot of us lay people don't. And I'd like you to read page 23 um, about from page 23, the issue with Billy, how you don't have the capacity as a medic to say, no, you don't need an ambulance. You don't need to go to the hospital. This is dumb, right?
Yeah. I don't have any notes marked on 23.
Okay.
Um, so let me find a good place to start.
Okay.
Maybe from the
You
top.
could start with it's hard to tell with Billy. He called today because his feet are itchy, right? Up at the
Yeah,
top of the page.
there we go. It's hard to tell with Billy. He called today because his feet are itchy. He smells like leather and vodka. My partner's pissed because he's already down a few charts and the radio's still sending out calls nonstop. We're not allowed to refuse transport to anyone, ever, even if their medical complaint is, well, itchy feet. In fact, as a paramedic, I'm not even allowed to recommend that the patient visit an urgent care instead of the emergency room, as ambulance companies do not believe our training prepares us to accept that kind of liability. Instead, I'm taught to encourage every single patient to be taken to the nearest hospital. And if they do not accept, I will write that they declined or refused transportation in my chart. Even if it is painfully clear to me that my patient does not need an expensive ambulance ride to an overcrowded ER, my protocols require me to try my best to convince them that they do. This policy, set on a county level, is true in most but not all parts of the United States.
Okay, stop there for a second
Yeah.
because that's really an interesting point that most of us don't get.
Yeah.
Protocols are what in this context? What do you face if you actually say to Billy at that point, dude, this is dumb. I'm not taking you to a
Yeah.
hospital for your itchy feet.
So paramedics technically work under a doctor's license. We don't have the same freedom that doctors do to make all of our own medical decisions. The doctor supervises us. So that used to mean back in the 70s when paramedics were first invented in their modern version, we would call the doc and say, hey, doc, this is what I got. What do you think I should do? And they would kind of give you instructions. And we were authorized to do certain skills that they had taught us how to do. And then over time, that became too much work. And the doctors just started writing down protocols. So each county you work in has a written set of protocols that says the doctor says paramedics are allowed to give this medication for this issue. It's kind of like a recipe book. So we go up on our patient. We have this memorized recipe book of a couple hundred things that we're allowed to do in different situations, different meds we're allowed to give, different procedures that we can do. And we find our patient. We think we know what's going on with them or we don't. And then we like pull from that recipe book. Okay, this person's having an asthma attack. I think I'm going to give the albuterol like it says I can. And so you get into some interesting liability issues because we're allowed to make some of our own decisions, but not all of them. And in the US, deciding who does and does not receive medical care is really sticky. There is a very, very well-intentioned series of laws written in the 70s saying that hospitals and doctors are not allowed to refuse care to emergency patients. It's called EMTALA. It was actually written after some famous cases of mothers going into childbirth who didn't have insurance, went to private hospitals, and private hospitals said, you're not going to pay for this. Screw this. We're not dealing with it, and kicked them out. And so moms were getting kicked out to public hospitals. Nobody likes babies dying in the streets. So when it comes to emergencies, as paramedics, if somebody says, I want to go to the hospital, I'm not allowed to tell them no.
You're not allowed to say this is not an emergency.
I'm not allowed to say, no, this is stupid. We're not going to take you. I have to take them. And then a doctor has to evaluate them. And the doctor can say, no, this is dumb, or, okay, we're going to check you out. But as a medic, I don't have that kind of freedom. I can talk to people. I can advise them. I can pull recipes from my cookbook. And if somebody doesn't want to go, if they change their mind and say, never mind, I don't think I'm going to, that's fine. Then I say, okay, sign this paperwork. We're going to let you go. But if they want to go, I have to take them. I cannot say no.
Now, the corollary is if they don't want to go, but they should go,
exactly,
you can't take them, right?
So the reverse of that
Yes.
is when as long as you have what's called capacity in the United States, if you're not drunk, if you're not confused, if you don't have a head injury, you're allowed to make your own medical decisions, even if they are stupid. You are allowed to make stupid decisions in the US up to a certain point. So if I have somebody, one of the first things that I have to do on a call is I have to decide whether they're sober enough to make their own medical decisions. If they are super intoxicated, if I think they have a head injury, if they're stumbling around slurring their words, then I'm going to force them to go, even if they don't want to, because I'm saying, sir, you're not in your right mind. You could have a head injury. You could have a bleed. We got to take you. Right. But if somebody is in their right mind, they're clear headed and they don't want to go, we don't kidnap people. We're not going to force them.
So now I'd like you to read that passage on page 56.
All right. So here's the opposite of Billy's call. Andrew and I swap a quick look and he walks towards the ambulance. Doesn't even, oh, no, I started one sentence too early. Here we go. Andrew says, he doesn't want to go, ma'am. We can't force him. What? She's shocked. Her sobs grow louder. She tried calling the police, but they left him here. She wants to know what will be done. This man needs our help. He's sick. He can't take care of himself. Who am I? She threatens to write down my name. She says I'm a monster. She says this city is all monsters. She wants to know what will be done. I know, ma'am. Yes, it's awful. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. He doesn't want our help. She asked me what my badge is for. That's what they all say. I can't help. I can't help. Well, who can? She moans. Someone has to help him. Am I the only one who cares? Her voice breaks on the last syllable. I mean, I get it. She wants this to be someone's fault. Life sucks, you know? A homeless, sick, opiate-addicted amputee stuck out in the cold, night after night, trapped under a wet bag of his own bowel movements. It's awful. No one wants that type of suffering to exist in the world. But I'm trained as a paramedic. I can restart a heart. I can splint a broken arm. If I take Randy to the hospital, I'll be giving him a ride to an overcrowded emergency room. I'll measure his blood pressure, probably check a sugar. I'll lift him over into an ER bed where an overworked doctor will give him a 3-minute once-over, maybe draw some labs, and tell a nurse to clean him up and kick him out. Then he'll be in a different neighborhood with a cleaner butt. To be fair, I think the clean butt would help prevent pain and infection, and that's why I tried so hard to talk him into going. But after that, he's back out on his own. So
read the next paragraph too. That's important.
Okay. We call ourselves the HRS sometimes. Homeless Relocation Services. Don't want to think about Randy? Call an ambulance. We'll move him for you. Then someone else a few blocks away will have to be faced with the excruciating pain of human existence for a few days. Just do me a favor and admit you're doing it for you, not for Randy. You just want the world to be different than it is.
That's pretty tough. We'll come back to that in a different way in just a little bit. But I want to ask you, when and how did you realize that you had to be taking notes on this? How'd that start?
Oh man. Well, I've kept journals since I was a little kid. In the process of writing the book, I went and reread all of them, which was a mission. And I found one from when I was like 5 or 6, 7, whenever you learn to write, that you bought for me, actually. You had me name it. I named it Kit. And I just started writing things down. And so for my whole life, often at the encouragement of you and Dad, whenever something intense would happen to me, I would write it down. It's how I sorted through my head. When I was going through something with a relationship, or when I was like trying to figure out a problem, or when I was really stressed or upset, I would just go write it down in my journal. And when I started doing something exciting or interesting and cool, when we would have family dinner, you and Dad would say, "Oh my God, are you writing this down? Are you taking notes? You have to be taking notes. You have to be writing this down."
Sorry about that.
And so I was trained from a very young age that if something interesting happens in your life, you write it down.
A complicated burden to lay on a kid. I know.
Yeah. And it was never with a specific goal in mind. It wasn't, I'm going to write a book about being a medic someday. That wasn't in my, it was just that if something interesting happens, you got to write it down. You got to take notes. Who knows? Maybe you'll use it later. Maybe you'll have to remember it.
Right.
You know, you're going to be furious that I brought this up, but the finger nub, you told me this story when I was a kid about how all good reporters have a callus on their finger for taking notes. Because
that
you have
was
to
back
take
in the day when we wrote stuff with a pen.
You have to take notes by hand with a pen. And I still have that callus. And it tells me that I'm like doing a good job in life if I'm doing interesting things and I'm writing them down. So I don't remember specifically taking notes about being an EMT because I was always taking notes about everything interesting that happened in my life. And so when I first got my EMT training and started working on the ambulance, it was like, oh man, here's some good. And I wrote it down. It's how I deal with everything. So there wasn't a specific moment, you know, it was the same as going through any transition, a big move, a new relationship, a pet, you know, like, here's a new job. We're going to write about this.
And I happen to know that during some of your young formative years, you walked around with a copy of Allen Ginsberg's Howl in your backpack.
Sure did.
Which for those of you who may be watching this and either don't remember or were not a part of the beat movement of the 1950s and 60s, was probably the most influential piece of poetry to come out of that movement, whose psychic center and geographic center was City Lights Books.
Yeah.
I want you to read a passage from the one about Seth, the passage I call Seth Nurse Crazy Man passage on page 59. And I want you to talk a little bit about the voices that were in your head influencing you as you started to write this down. But first, read that passage, if you would.
Okay, so we're going to start. So Seth, for those who are just showing up, is the nighttime charge nurse at one of the downtown hospitals, which means he kind of runs the show. And we are in the middle of the night hanging out at the ER. It takes quite a thing to make Seth say, "Holy shit." The man is unbreakable. And yet here it comes. A holy shit in the night, rattle smacking down the hallway, knocking over vitals caddies and upending trays. The patient has been restrained to a backboard, a common technique, so his wrists and ankles are tied to a heavy plastic rectangle behind him. He's naked save for the white straps of the restraints. He's sweaty and pale and bug-eyed, with long, floppy, greasy hair slapping against the board and pale pink parts slapping against his legs. He's so far beyond jacked up on whatever the fuck drug he's on that he's managed to jerk and jump the whole backboard restraints body aggregate off the edge of the bed, and he's making a break for it, hopping the backboard side to side. He's a Red Queen's playing card. He's a straitjacket crucifixion. He's a full-speed, full-sized, full-noise blast of crazy, whack-waddling through the ER, leaving a wake of sideways equipment and open mouths. The physics required to keep this guy upright and in forward motion are unimaginable. But here he comes, down the hallway, around the corner, and no sooner do we hear the rattle smack from Tweaker Jesus, the holy shit from Seth, then comes a guttural roar. Our shortest security guard, head down, knees bent, running full running start football tackles the guy and blasts him onto the floor. And now the layers of backboard, naked guy, and security guard are all tied up and sliding across the ER with bits and pieces flying off like a cartoon cyclone. And that's all the medics need to abandon their patients and jump into the brawl. One tired-looking EMT rolls her eyes and stays behind, guarding all three gurneys in the hallway, while the other 5 medics pile onto the guy like dogs on a stake, everyone howling and grabbing limbs and doing their best to dodge the greasy hair and floppy wiener flying around in the fight.
All right. So I very much doubt that while you were writing that, you said to yourself, oh, look at me. I'm channeling Jack Kerouac. But what do you think about you read, I know, a ton of different voices when you realized that
Yeah.
you wanted to pull this into a book. Um, Talk about that a little bit. Who were some of the voices?
Yeah. One of the things that I did when I started really writing was just reading as much as I could, as many different voices, because I don't have an English degree. I don't have a master's, and I just wanted all those voices in my head. And you taught me about sentences and about voices, and how important it was. And I read things to myself. I read them out loud. Sometimes I would type them over. Um, so I read a lot. You gave me actually Dispatches by Michael Hare. That was a huge influence, just the rawness and the aggression of the writing. You know, he didn't really bother with like plot and narrative. It was just all description. So that was a big one. I reread Oliver Sacks. I read Frankenstein for the first time because I wanted like an old timey kind of 1800s voice. I wanted those long, intricate sentences in my head. And then I realized that book is like disturbingly relevant to my work. You know, bringing somebody, what is the line between life and death? What does it actually mean to be alive? Yeah. What are some of the others? I keep them. I'm looking at my pile because I kept a specific pile of voices. I read Last Exit to Brooklyn a couple of times. I read basically I just wanted a breadth of voices.
Yeah.
Dennis Johnson too. A couple of people recommended that. And I read a lot of nonfiction for the book. To bring in actual knowledge and research, but I also wanted fiction. I wanted sentences. I reread Mary Roach a couple times when I was trying to write the nonfiction parts and make them punchy and funny. And I didn't realize how much of an influence the Beats had on the way that I really thought about words and sentences until much later in the process. I started rereading Anais Nin because I love her sentences, and Henry Miller. I'm fascinated with their back and forth. And then I found my old copy of Howl and I picked it up and I said, like Nurse Seth in the middle of the night, holy shit. Because a lot of my book is about, not just my book, a lot of my experience as a medic became about mental illness. It became about meth. It became about homelessness. And I mean, the opening couple lines of Howl, right? I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. I had the first couple pages of the poem memorized when I was a kid. And it really informed, I didn't realize how much it informed the way that I was a medic until I was walking around and I had that line replaying in my head, just stuck in my head like an earworm. I would be running calls on these people who were buck naked, screaming, ripping their clothes off, eating trash, throwing feces. You know, those of us who are in San Francisco have come face to face with this. And I kept hearing over and over again in the back of my head, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. The best minds of my generation, starving, hysterical, naked. And I would run calls on people who were starving and hysterical and naked. And in the back of my head somewhere, I'd always think, maybe these are the best minds of my generation.
Wow.
Maybe these kids were really smart and really brilliant and really wonderful people. And then the meth ate their brains and now they're doing this. And people would say, where did you find your compassion? And it's so crazy because Howl is not known to be a compassionate poem. That's not what it's famous for. But somehow that's what my head took out of it, you know?
I want to talk a little bit about the difference between the actual work that you were doing, that you were just very graphically describing, and the image of paramedics, which you talk about a lot about in the
Yeah.
book, right? And one of the things I want to start with is codes. Codes and cardiac arrest, which are, of course, the classic scene in any televised or movie version of a medic. Talk about codes, what a code save is like, and what they actually do, how you
Yeah.
have to do them anyway, right?
One of the only strict rules I made for myself before I started writing, really getting into the writing of the book, was I'm not opening it with a code. I refuse because it's such a gut instinct to open with that moment because it is such a quintessential paramedic moment. That's like what, we are on TV. That's what we do. And I was like, I'm not opening my book that way. I refuse.
Why?
Because there's a ton of reasons. They're such a small part of what we do. They represent those calls. We run them maybe once a month, true lights and sirens, life or death emergencies. Oh my God, this guy's bleeding out. This guy's having a stroke. He's having a code. Let's go. Adrenaline, sirens, yelling, flashing, right? Those are maybe 4 or 5% of our calls. They're one in every, 20, 30, 40 calls. 95% of the work we do is homeless, mental illness, the elderly, poor people, addiction, folks who just like need a little bit of help, don't have anyone else to call. And the codes that we do run, since that's where we started, if you want to go down that road, or if we're going to keep talking about codes, when somebody's heart stops beating, if we get to it fast enough, sometimes we can start it up again. That's it. That's all a code is. The science behind it is really fun and interesting. I had a blast learning the science. I had a lot of fun learning some of the stories of how they used to do them, and some of the insane experiments that got them to that science. But all a code is, ready, clear, adrenaline, CPR, save a life. Yeah, code save. What it really means is when somebody's heart stops, sometimes it stops all the way. Sometimes it wiggles for a little bit. If we can catch it during the wiggly bit, sometimes we can get it going again. And ethically, it gets really, really weird, because when somebody's really young, they're otherwise healthy, and they like drop from a heart attack in the middle of a deli while they're ordering a sandwich, and we rush in and we do CPR and we save them and we get them back. That's great. Those calls are awesome. Woohoo, saved a life. But again, those are such a small fraction of the codes that we run. Most of the codes we run are folks who are really elderly. They're really, really sick. They've been sick for a long time. Their bodies are giving out. They're ready to die. And CPR is really violent. We break ribs. The patient vomits like crazy, like just gallons of vomit, because you unload their entire stomach contents. They start bleeding. They'll bleed into the tube because we're tearing their esophagus apart. We're breaking all their ribs. We're bruising up their chest. And so when you get somebody who's like 103 years old, they've got terminal cancer, they have dementia, so they don't know their own name. They're already really confused. And our job is to go in and start wailing on their chest and try to get their heart started again. You find yourself in your head playing a lot of games where you're like, what the heck am I doing? And almost universally, medical providers agree that it's not the right thing to do, that it's ethically, morally, and medically the wrong thing to do, that we should let people die a natural death. But we have liability in the US. We have a lot of religious backgrounds in the US that don't agree with that. We have a lot of people's emotions getting in the way. And we have a lot of people on TV. A lot of people have watched a lot of TV and have these ideas that like, oh, grandma's a fighter. We're going to save her. We're going to get her back. And so, it's something I could talk about for a long time that I feel really, really passionately about.
And again, the system, as it presently stands, doesn't allow you to make that decision, right?
Correct.
Just say, doing a code on this lady is going to cause so much grief and damage that I decline to do it. You don't have that option, right?
Correct.
Unless the pink paper, right?
Yeah. So in the United States, we save first and ask questions later, right? The assumption is that this person wants everything to be done. And that's not true worldwide. There are countries, and this is something I'd love to do more research on, but there are countries where they say, nah, we're going to let this go. But in the US, we do everything we possibly can unless there's a really strict legal protection. And so what happens is, everybody's heard of a DNR at this point, a do not resuscitate order. In California, you can do paperwork. You can sit down with your doctors, with your family, and do paperwork that says, I don't want CPR to be performed on me. It's usually done in terminal patients, people with cancer, people who are elderly and dying. And then you fill out a form, everybody signs it. and then you post it up on the fridge, or you stick it in your wallet and forget about it, or you put it in some file cabinet where no one can ever find it. And so as a paramedic, when I arrive on scene, if I see, and in California, they're bright pink so that we can see them. If I see a piece of paper that says do not resuscitate, and it's dated, it's signed, we can confirm the patient's identity with like their ID or whatever, I'm allowed to stop. But if I don't see that piece of paper, and we have about 30 seconds to make that decision when we first walk into somebody's house. We've got maybe 20, 30 seconds before we're going to start compressions. And once we start, we're kind of off to the races. Sometimes you've got enough people on scene that most of you are coding the patient, and then somebody is like still looking through the drawers trying to find the paperwork. But for the most part, if we don't see that piece of paper right away, or it's not signed properly, or it's not dated, or there's like some question and we're not sure, then we're doing it. We're coding them. And we have to. That's the legal and medical culture in the States, is you do everything you possibly can. And that sounds really good on paper. You know, we try to save everybody. We do everything we can. But the word save is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence.
Yes.
Um,
And the 5% lights and sirens, 95% dealing with issues, more socially worker kind of stuff. How much of that is San Francisco, which has a perhaps overblown reputation for more homelessness and craziness than a lot of other places? How much of that is the city's structure and society, as opposed to what you've learned by talking to and reading about medics all over the United States?
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of paramedicine and EMS is just how universal it is. You would think that it would be just San Francisco, because San Francisco is kind of famous for its homelessness. But San Francisco does not actually have a monopoly on poverty or social issues or methamphetamine. It's a little bit more in your face in SF, because the areas of really a lot of homelessness are right next to a lot of areas with a lot of tourism and wealth. So you just see it more. But it's kind of hilarious how universal it is. I worked in 3 counties, in Reno, Nevada, Santa Cruz, California, and SF. And I have good friends who've worked in, I don't know, probably 20 counties. And I've read a lot from other places. And it's very, very universal across the US and even globally, that ambulances are not just used for emergencies. In Reno, they don't have quite as much visible tent encampment homelessness, because a lot of them live in cheap weekly motels or in trailer parks. But there's poverty everywhere. And that's going to be the vast majority of your calls. There's also old people everywhere. A lot of your calls on the ambulance are just the elderly. And even globally, I read a memoir from Australia where they do have public health care. And that medic is really frustrated because only a small fraction of his calls are really genuine emergencies. Most of them are people calling for minor medical complaints. And one of the things that I thought about a lot over my career, and I wrote about some, is that it's kind of just due to the nature of the ambulance. If you have a phone number that you can call, and the ambulance isn't free, it's very expensive, but it kind of is free, because we don't charge you up front. We send you a bill later. And if you don't pay your bill, nothing happens.
I want you to read, there's a passage that's right on point here on page 159 that I want you to read as we start talking about some of the structural weirdness of the ambulance system, which you learned a ton about as you were researching this book.
Imagine a shoe store where a customer walks in, is given a pair of shoes, and then leaves and receives a bill in the mail. Now imagine that they're not required to provide their mailing address or even their full name in order to receive the shoes. Now imagine that without the shoes, they will die. How many of those shoes do you think are getting paid for? Ambulances were never profitable. Most patients were poor and few paid their bill. From their earliest conception, civilian ambulances lost money for hospitals, lost money for police, and lost money for cities. Funeral homes scraped out a profit barely by paying their drivers terribly and refusing calls in poor areas.
So there's another line that comes not a little bit after that that I'd like you to sort of unpack, and I'm going to read
Mhm.
that line, and because
Okay.
you're talking so much about the weird structural history of the ambulance system and how it led us to where we are today. You write not long after that one, this white lie has allowed private ambulance companies to keep their staffing levels homicidally low while turning a profit. Okay? Talk about that. What's the white lie? The relationships between fire department and ambulance services.
Yeah.
Unpack that a little for us.
So I'm going to talk about the first thing and then the white lie. The um, ambulance companies, they don't make money. Emergency medicine famously in the US loses money. And that's true of emergency rooms in hospitals also, because we're required by law to treat everyone. And everyone's going to get a bill in the mail. But if you get an ambulance bill, you don't pay it, we're not going to cut off your service. It's not like an electric company where next time you call 911, they're going to be like, sorry, you don't get one. You can keep calling as many times as you want. It'll ding your credit eventually if you stop paying your bill. But if you're the type of person who's not going to be applying for a home loan anytime soon, which most of our patients are, there's really not a huge consequence for not paying your ambulance bill. And we have people who've racked up multi-millions of dollars in ambulance bills, and they just keep calling us like 3 or 4 times a day. That's very common in pretty much universally across the country. And so it's very hard to make money as an ambulance company. You make a little bit of money by doing prearranged private transfers for people that have insurance. You know, you got to go from like your nursing home to dialysis. And you make a little bit of money from the rare sucker who actually does pay their bill. You know, we hear about how ambulance bills are really expensive. That's really common on TV. Oh my God, my ambulance bill is $2,000. All they did was put a Band-Aid on me. It's because you're the first person who's paid this month, right? And so ambulance companies have always struggled to keep their staffing. They've always paid their drivers and their medical people really, really poorly. And it used to be drivers and medical attendants were different. We drive now. The medical attendants drive. That's the same thing these days. So they pay really badly. They work their medics to the bone as hard as they can, and they never quite have enough ambulances in service. And that's something that is really, really prevalent these days. We're always hurting for staffing. We're always getting held over late. There's always calls stacked. We never get much downtime. And I wanted to reach back and see how far that went. And it's gotten worse in recent years, but it's always kind of been a theme. Whereas the fire department has generally been volunteer or publicly funded. Communities love their fire departments, right? Politicians love fire departments. They get a lot of funding. It's a good, stable, fully pensioned government job. They have tons of resources, right? In San Francisco, there are either 50 or 51 fire stations. There's one for about every square mile in the whole city. And that's stations with engines, trucks, firehouses, you know, gyms, everything. And that's not going anywhere. You're not going to get votes as a politician by saying, I think we should fire half the firefighters, right? And that's as it should be. Fire is really important. And so one thing that happened in the 80s is there was a lot of fire departments. They were really well funded all over the city, and building materials science and sprinkler systems made it so that urban fires, house fires in cities suddenly became a lot less common and a lot less deadly. The fires got way, way safer. There was much less need in cities for firefighters. I want to make a point that wildland firefighting is really different. That's been a big issue, especially in California, but all over the country recent. Cal Fire is like horrifically underfunded. They have like 3 dozers for the whole state. They don't get paid enough. They work their butts off. But urban departments and wildland departments are formed really and funded really differently in California, at least, but also all over the states. So urban departments didn't have a lot to do in the 80s. They were kind of hanging out. They had a lot of funding and they weren't putting out a lot of fires. Meanwhile, ambulances were just as like haggard and understaffed and underfunded as they'd always been. They were screaming around trying to get from call to call. They never had enough people. They couldn't get to calls on time. And the fire departments, they were looking at browning out stations and laying off firefighters, which is a really bad look. So they cut a deal. They cut a deal with the ambulances saying, hey, we're all sitting around our station with nothing to do. we have CPR training. We have some basic medical training because we've trained our own guys. What if we go to the calls first? We start whatever needs to get done, and then you guys will get here when you can and take over care. And it seemed like a really cool idea in the 80s because you had all these firefighters who didn't really have much to do, and you had these medics who were really overworked. And especially in a CPR case, it really does matter if somebody's there sooner, starting CPR earlier. And this was coming off the back of a lot of that research that had just been done about CPR, that they'd really discovered how much of a difference it makes if you're there faster. And so they cut this deal and it worked really well, sort of. What ended up happening is that there's a couple of cases. CPR is the big one, where if the firefighters get there first, they can start doing chest compressions. They can start saving the brain, the blood, keep the blood around to the brain. And then when the paramedics get there, they can take over. And it's really helpful. Most of the rest of the time, it doesn't really make a difference if fire's there sooner. But what it did is the firefighters got to keep their jobs and the ambulances got to pretend that they were starting care sooner than they were, because the city could now tell their citizens, we're going to have somebody there to take care of you within 8 minutes or less. And what the city didn't tell their citizens is that somebody's going to be a firefighter on an engine with basic medical training who doesn't have the ability to transport, who's not going to take your loved one to the hospital. And the paramedic, meanwhile, because we chose not to fund them, is going to get there in 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whenever they get the chance. And so it became sort of this central core challenge of EMS. And if you talk to people who run fire departments, they will tell you it's very important that we get there first. We have to be able to start care. We do our assessment. We can help the medics with the scene. It's really helpful. And if you talk to people who run EMS departments, they tend to say, this is really fucked up and it has fundamentally destroyed EMS in America. And so it's inside the EMS community, it's super controversial. It's a big effing mess. It causes a lot of problems. And outside of EMS, nobody even knows that it's happening. People are like, why is there a fire engine here?
And there's a second set of structural issues that runs right alongside that I had to learn from you. You never complained about this while you were on the job, sitting at the dinner table, trying to maintain steady conversation, that you summarize in the book as economic streamlining, street postings. Unpack some of that terminology to explain how the systemic arrangement of EMS contributes to the problem.
Yeah. So police are publicly funded. Fire departments are publicly funded. Hospitals are privately run, right? And we all know how screwed up the private healthcare industry is in the US. I don't have to go into that. And ambulances are in like a weird gray area where we're kind of treated like a private healthcare entity, but people kind of think that we're like public safety, like police and fire. And in most places it's private, but in some places it's public, and the funding is really screwed up everywhere. And so one of the things that's happened in the last 10, 20 years, and one of the things I do in the book that's really, really important to me is it's not just my voice. I also interviewed other EMTs, other paramedics, supervisors, dispatchers, even firefighters, and I got their voices in there too. And I really love that. That's the part of the book that I'm the most proud of. And so one of the guys I talked to, Dan Quino, he's been in EMS for like 40 years. He's been a supervisor in Santa Cruz. Amazing, amazing guy. He's an absolute legend. He talked a lot about watching his county change over the last 40 years. And there's a lot of conversation. I assume anybody who's listening to the City Lights podcast is familiar with some of the ways that private equity has made healthcare a little weird in the US in the last 20 years. And what a lot of people don't realize is that private equity has also gotten their greasy paws into ambulances and EMS. And so back in the 80s and 90s, some companies figured out, hey, we're buying up healthcare companies, we're buying up fast food companies. Let's buy up ambulance companies too. Let's see if we can streamline them and turn this thing around, make some profit off of it. And so what's the best way to make a profit in like a screwed up business model, right? By treating your employees like crap. And so there a lot of people get really surprised when I talk about, if you've ever worked at like a restaurant, right? Where everybody was running around all the time, you're totally understaffed, everything's screwed up, they pay you as low as they possibly can. But you just kind of are struggling with not enough employees to make it work. That is also the way that ambulance companies are run. If you keep labor costs low, you can try to cut a profit. And people get so shocked when you tell them this. They're like, but why aren't you staffed appropriately? And it's like, because that costs money. The people who own these companies are trying to make money, just like people who own restaurants or Office Depot, whatever.
But it's not just staffing, it's also how you're expected to live.
Yeah, no, we're
right?
not in some magical bubble where we're like, because we're so important, we're treated better. That doesn't exist, right? So some of the systemic issues that you're talking about, ambulances used to run out of stations like a firehouse on a 24-hour shift. They'd rest between calls. They had little cots to sleep in. They'd run out and go get an emergency, and then they'd come back to station. That's no longer a thing. Some rural areas do still have stations where they're really slow, but most urban areas and busy areas in the US now, we don't have stations. We do what's called street posting, which means you get in the rig and then you drive around in a van for a 12-hour shift, running calls, just bing, 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 back and forth in the city.
A van that has no ergonomic consideration for the driver built into it, right?
So long haul truck drivers have these big ergonomic seats with like the airflow and the vents and the extra padding. We don't have any of that. It's kind of like an Amazon delivery van. We're just in a crappy seat. The seats don't go back very far, maybe an inch or two, because they have to make room for all our equipment. They're old and busted. They're not very well padded. And we don't have stations. We can't get out and stretch our legs. You get in the van, you run calls for 12 hours. Usually get held over late because we're so understaffed. So it's maybe 12 hours if you're lucky. Sometimes it's more like 15, 16, 17 hours that you're stuffed in the van, running calls. If you do get some downtime in between calls, if it's a slow day, we do what's called street posting, which means they give you a street corner to go park at. We don't have our own bathrooms. We don't have anywhere to heat up our food. We can go up to the hospitals. A lot of the hospitals will let us use their staff microwave, but we don't have stations the way that firefighters do. And we're extremely understaffed, and that's really, really common everywhere. And in most places, the pay is pretty crap. And part of the reason for that comes back around to the fire department stuff. A lot of paramedics are basically enduring this work for a couple years so that they can get over to the fire department. But the average lifespan of a paramedic is like 3 to 5 years.
And just to clarify, when you say get over to the fire department, you were employed by the fire department. But the fire department, when you say get over to the fire department, you mean going to what they call suppression, going to put out fires, get on the 24 schedule, not ride around in the ambulance anymore, right?
Yeah. So this one gets a little convoluted. There's basically 3 ways that ambulances get run commonly in the US. There's more, but the most common ones. Either you're privately owned, right, by AMR or Falck or Royal, just like straight up private equity profit company. Or they're run in very rare cases by the public health department as like a true government run entity. Those are really rare and they're really desirable. People love working for those, but there's not many of them left. Or the other most common way is that they're actually run out of the fire department. And that's something that's happened a lot in the last 10 or 20 years is fire departments are merging with ambulance departments. And it's super controversial. The fire departments tend to like it because they get bigger, they get more powerful. Most like true kind of EMS heads say that it's actually really bad for EMS because the fire department's primary focus is always going to be putting out fire. They do those mergers and the EMS chief always reports to the fire chief. They've never done one of those mergers and then suddenly had the EMS chief running the whole place and the fire department reporting to them. The fire departments, and this is true in San Francisco, tend to see EMS as this kind of secondary task that they're supposed to take on. It's like their extra thing that they now have to deal with. It's never seen as the primary focus. The primary focus is always going to be putting out fires. And so they tend to try to keep the EMS side sort of as easy as they can. They staff it low. They don't give them stations. They don't give us a lot of extra training. They actually, a lot of the time they tend to avoid extra training. And so it gets sort of shunted to the side and not treated the same way as the firefighters.
And one of the consequences that also surprised me from your storytelling and also your book is that the physical injuries that so many paramedics suffer and that end so many paramedic careers early, like yours, working in the ambulance at any rate, aren't really caused the way we civilians tend to think, hauling the 300-pound guy down the stairs. It's
Yeah.
from other purposes, right? From these ergonomically terrible vehicles, from being unable to use the gym, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, we get hurt a lot. Paramedics have by far the highest rate of back injury of all healthcare providers and public safety workers. We get hurt more often than firefighters, more often than nurses. And people think it's because we're out there doing all this badass stuff, right? We're picking people up, we're carrying them, we're saving lives, we're hanging off
Right.
the sides of buildings. And it's true that the injury itself does usually occur when you're lifting someone. But it's not because of the lift. It's because you've been stuffed in a van for the last 13 hours with no opportunity to get out and stretch your legs or use the gym or rest between calls. And you're just running call after call, or you're sitting in traffic, or you're stuck in the van. And then all of a sudden you got to go up to the 7th floor, pick up some dude that's 300 pounds and carry him down the stairs. Of course your back's going to go out, you know? And that's also true on night shift. Night shift paramedics also stuck in the van for 12 hours. They don't get cots to rest on. They don't get beds. The seats still don't go back. You're sitting up at 4 a.m, you know, like this. And then all of a sudden you get a call. Of course we're going to hurt our backs, you know? And those are like very preventable injuries. All you would have to do is spend more money on your medics and on their living situation, which companies don't want to do. So they don't.
Well, that leads us toward the wind up. One of the wind up passages that I wanted to have you read is the one on page 378. I know you've had to make it clear over and over that paramedics can't fix society, and that every time somebody looks at you across a table and says, "So what should we do to fix this, to make San Francisco not have these problems?" You get this look on your face like, I don't know, right? But you have a great passage there about what actually could be done. And I'd like you to start with the poverty social welfare on page 378.
Yes. Poverty, social welfare, and the brutality of the American healthcare industry will always be a battle for our profession. But the labor issues that plague our ambulances, the fix for this seems impossible in its simplicity. Treat your employees better. Hire enough of us to do the job safely. Pay us more, staff us higher, stop making us work 48 hours in a row without sleep or bathroom breaks, or bathroom breaks or seats that recline. Just stop it. Better rested paramedics in less pain. This is so easy, so obvious, will produce better outcomes for patients. Of course, for this to happen, corporations would have to stop rewriting the law to squeeze every last penny of productivity out of their employees, no matter who dies waiting for an ambulance. And lawmakers would have to stop letting them get away with it. The owners of $40 billion private equity firms would have to stop their yachts for 3 seconds and think about the mile-high pyramid of human suffering upon which their fortunes are built. Counties would have to demand better staffing, higher pay, and shifts that end when they're supposed to. Hospitals would have to upstaff their nurses and doctors instead of bullying ambulance companies into sitting on their patients in triage area for half the day. Treating many of the problems faced by today's ambulances requires nothing less or more than pressure against the heavy grinding wheel of American capitalism. I personally believe this is achievable, but that might be the Oakland in me talking.
When you walk around the city now, are you able to turn off the X-ray vision a little bit, or is it going to be with you forevermore?
Oh, it's forever.
It's
Yeah,
forever.
no, not a chance. Every time I'm in San Francisco, I feel like I'm in the office. And that's true. I worked in Santa Cruz for like 1 year, probably 15 years ago. And I still have flashbacks of like if I walk past a particular street corner, you know, or if I go past a particular house, I'll remember bringing someone in or pulling him out of there.
And let's make it clear, you stopped the active ambulance work not because the psychic burden, although tremendous, got to you, but because of the physical burden, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I now have low back, left shoulder, and right wrist injuries. And I really loved the work. I would still do it if I could. And I still sort of fantasize about picking up part-time somewhere, working a couple of shifts a month. But
And you're teaching now, right?
yeah, I
Yeah.
teach and I really love teaching, and I feel like kind of a fraud that I'm teaching, but I'm no longer in the field. I would really like to get back in the field, but I physically can't do it anymore. I got one too many injuries. I just can't. I can't sit for 12 hours. I can't be in that sort of position. I can't lift heavy stuff really anymore. That's kind of probably going to be with me forever. And that's pretty common. Most paramedics, I got 10 years, which is actually considered like a long lifespan for paramedics. Most get 3 to 5.
Wow, that's short.
Yeah, a lot of them don't injure out. A lot of them just move on. A lot of them go into fire suppression or over to nursing school.
And the realization that fire suppression is less taxing. It's not an easy job, obviously,
No,
but it's
no,
less
not at all.
taxing on the body.
Yes.
Than the paramedic job is also pretty startling for most of us.
It's much more sustainable. I mean, most of my friends went over to fire suppression. That's what you do. And they all say it's so much better, Joe. It's such a better lifestyle. We get treated better. We get valued as employees. It's still a hard life. Don't get me wrong. That is still a very challenging job and a lot of respect. And they deserve to get rest breaks and get paid a lot. I just wish that medics were also given that consideration.
There's a marvelous passage that I want to wind up on that I loved reading on pages 320, 328, 329 is where I want you to read from. But to make this clear for the listener, the viewer's eye, this little chapter is called "Why I Hate My Job, Why I Love My Job." And "Why I Hate My Job" runs down one column, while "Why I Love My Job" runs down a second column simultaneously, right? And I want you to start on page 328. And then you can go, first I want you to do "Why I Hate My Job," and then I want you to do "Why I Love My Job." Okay?
Okay.
"Why I Hate My Job" by Joanna Sokol, paramedic.
Because our most challenging patients are cycled through the system over and over and over and over. And as a street paramedic, there's nothing I can do but keep on spinning the wheel. Because my back hurts, because my shoulder hurts, because my wrists hurt, because my stomach hurts, because my neck hurts, because I'm so, so tired. Because this patient's pain is legitimate, but I am so exhausted, so burned out, so bone tired that I simply don't care anymore. I can hear how flat my voice sounds when I speak, and I can tell how shocked my patient is that someone could act so inhumanely, but I simply have nothing left to give.
"Why I Love My Job" by Joanna Sokol.
Here's the fun part. Because when someone posts on our station Facebook page about designing an official EMS mascot, the two winning ideas are a black sheep and an enormously fat raccoon. Because even when you don't save a life, you can make people who are very scared and very alone feel just a little bit safer.
I gotta say, that's one of the places where when I was reading, I started to cry.
No.
Peter, thank you very much for giving us the chance to talk about this in this forum. Back to you.
Well, thank you both for gracing our virtual halls. It has been a real pleasure. Joanna Sokol, congratulations on a very compelling and deeply touching new book. And Cynthia Gorney, thank you for your generosity in doing the honors today. Most grateful to you both. For everyone watching, we have posted links in the event description with which you may purchase copies of Stories from the Ambulance. Better yet, if you're in the hood, come on down, pay us a visit, browse our stacks. We are one of the great bookstore browsing experiences. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district. We're open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. As always, today's program has been made possible from support by the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our community outreach, and our educational programming, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So goodbye, everyone. Take care. We hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.